The rifle was already leveled at her chest when Milton Shelby stepped out of the shadows. Annie Holloway had not screamed. That was the first thing he noticed. She stood in the doorway of her homestead with her jaw set and her dark eyes blazing, the lantern light catching the copper in her hair, and she looked at the man pointing the gun at her like she had been waiting for him to show his face for a very long time. There was no fear in her posture, only fury, and something underneath the fury that Milton recognized, because he had worn that same expression for 2 years after his own world had collapsed. It was the look of a person who had already survived the worst thing and was simply refusing to be destroyed again. The man with the rifle was Clem Rourke. Milton knew Clem Rourke. Everyone in Caldwell County, Kansas knew Clem Rourke in the autumn of 1882. He was the land agent, the fixer, the quiet instrument of Harlan Voss, who owned 3 cattle empires and had decided that the 40 acres belonging to Annie Holloway sat directly in the path of the most lucrative railroad expansion the territory had ever seen. Voss wanted the land. Rourke was the kind of man Voss sent to acquire things that were not for sale. "You are going to sign those papers," Rourke said. His voice was unhurried, almost pleasant, the way a man sounds when he believes the outcome is already decided. "Or you are going to regret every single sunrise you see after tonight." Annie said nothing. She looked at the papers in his other hand, and then she looked at his face, and the silence between them was so thick it had weight. Milton stepped into the lantern light. He was not a large man in the theatrical sense. He was broad through the shoulders and lean through the middle, with hands that were scarred from fencing wire and honest work. And he had a quietness about him that people sometimes mistook for slowness until they had seen him move. He moved now with absolute precision, placing himself between the barrel of that rifle and Annie Holloway's chest without a single wasted step, and he looked at Clem Rourke with the kind of patience that is only possible in a man who has already decided he will not be the one to blink. "Rourke," he said, "just the name, nothing else." Rourke stared at him. The rifle wavered by perhaps 1/4 of an inch, which was a very significant 1/4 of an inch in the economy of threats. "Shelby." "This is none of your business." "I am making it my business," Milton said. The night held its breath. The Kansas plains stretched out behind them, black and immense, and the only sounds were the wind moving through the tall grass and the distant complaint of Milton's horses in their corral 1/4 mile east. He had left them there. He had left his supper untouched on the table when he had seen the lantern light moving wrong across Annie's property, too purposeful, too late in the evening, and he had come without a weapon, because a weapon would have made this a different kind of confrontation, and he had not wanted that. He had wanted Rourke to understand that the obstacle standing between him and Annie Holloway was not a gun. It was a man who was not going to move. Rourke held the standoff for a long, evaluating moment. Then he lowered the rifle. He lowered it slowly, theatrically, with the manner of someone who wants you to understand he is choosing to stand down rather than being forced to, and he rolled up the papers and pointed them at Milton like a teacher with a ruler. "Voss is going to hear about this," he said. "I expect he will," Milton said. Rourke left. His horse was tied to the fence post at the end of Annie's property line, and he mounted it without looking back and rode north into the dark, and Milton watched him go until the sound of hooves faded completely into the prairie silence. Then he turned around. Annie Holloway was looking at him with an expression that was impossible to read and utterly impossible to ignore. She had lowered the lantern, and the softer angle of the light made her look younger than her 27 years and older at the same time, the way that hard life has a tendency to do to people it has tested repeatedly and found worth keeping. She had a smudge of axle grease on her left forearm that she had not managed to wash off before dark, and one of her bootlaces was loose, and she was the most arresting thing Milton Shelby had looked directly at in as long as he could honestly remember. "You have been watching my property," she said. It was not an accusation. It was not quite a question. It landed somewhere in between. "Yes," he said. "How long?" He considered lying and dismissed the impulse. For nights, she absorbed this. The wind moved her hair across her cheek and she did not push it back. Why? He could have told her about the overheard conversation at the feed store, where two of Voss's riders had been too comfortable and too careless in their talk. He could have told her about the dark past that connected Harlan Voss to the destruction of 3 other small operations in the county over the past 18 months. Operations whose owners had been pressured and threatened and ultimately broken, until they signed whatever Voss's men put in front of them. He could have given her the logical, practical answer that would have made this professional and distant and safe. Instead, he told her the truth, which was more complicated than all of that. "Because you are alone out here," he said, "and you should not have to be." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. That was how it began, though everything that mattered had already been in motion for months before that night, running underground like water under the hardpan, invisible until it finally broke the surface and became impossible to deny. The story of Annie Holloway and Milton Shelby really started in the spring of 1882, in the ordinary machinery of a small frontier community that was growing too fast for its own good and not quite sure what it was becoming. Caldwell County sat in the southern reach of Kansas, where the Kishom Trail had carved itself into the land, and the cattle drives still moved through in long, dusty processions that smelled of sweat and enterprise. The town of Harlow had a post office, a general store run by the Peabody family, a barber shop that doubled as a dentist's office in emergencies, a proper church with a bell that the congregation was very proud of, and a saloon that the congregation pretended not to notice. It had a sheriff named Amos Decker, who was 61 years old, incompetent and tired, and it had the looming, growing shadow of Harlan Voss, who had arrived in the county 4 years earlier with capital and ambition, and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Milton Shelby had been in the county for 6 years. He had come down from Colorado with a small herd and a lease on 80 acres of grazing land and a quietness that people in Harlow initially found unsettling because they could not locate the cause of it. He was not sullen. He was not rude. He was simply a man who had learned to live inside himself in a way that left very little visible on the surface, and the visible part was always careful and deliberate and measured. He paid his debts on time. He was fair to his animals. He helped when help was needed, and he did not ask for credit or conversation in return. The county had eventually decided he was simply private and left him to it. What the county did not know, and what Milton had no particular interest in explaining, was the history he had come to Kansas to get distance from. He had been married once, briefly and catastrophically, to a woman named Clara Whitmore in a Colorado mining town where the winters came in fast and the ground was too hard, and the loneliness had a quality that wore through people like sandpaper over time. Clara had not been cruel. She had not been dishonest in any dramatic sense. She had simply not been able to sustain herself in that life, and the person she had turned into by the second winter was not the person either of them had understood her to be, and the marriage had dissolved in a way that left no villain but left plenty of wreckage. Clara had gone back to Ohio, and Milton had come south and east, and had spent 2 years rebuilding himself into something quieter and more durable than what he had been before. He did not talk about Clara. He did not romanticize the loss. But he also did not pretend it had not taught him things, chief among them a deep wariness of the gap between who a person appeared to be and who they became when the territory proved harder than expected. He had watched Annie Holloway from that careful distance since the first week she appeared in Harlow in February of 1882. She had come alone, which was the first thing anyone noticed. A young widow traveling alone to claim the 40 acres her late husband had filed on before he died of typhoid fever in November of 1881 was unusual enough to be remarked upon, and it was remarked upon with varying degrees of sympathy and skepticism, depending on who was doing the remarking. The more pragmatic voices in Harlow suggested she would sell the claim within 3 months and go back wherever she had come from. The sympathetic voices said what a hard thing it was, and what a brave thing, and meant both sincerely. A smaller number of voices said nothing, but watched her with the focused attention of people calculating possibility. Milton Shelby had been among the watchers, though his watching was of a different quality than the calculating kind. What he observed was this. Annie Holloway arrived in February with 2 trunks, a crate of tools, a milk cow named Duchess, and an absolute refusal to be discouraged. She took possession of a homestead that had been standing empty since the previous October, and that showed every sign of that vacancy. The roof of the small house had a leak that had become 2 leaks over the winter. The fence line along the north boundary had come down in 3 places. The well had developed a tendency to fill with sediment after heavy rain. There was a second structure on the property that had been intended as a barn, but was 3/4 complete and therefore not quite a barn and not quite nothing, which was somehow worse than either extreme. She repaired the roof. She walked the fence line in boots that were not quite right for the mud and drove posts with a mallet that was slightly too heavy for her frame, and did both these things with a focused efficiency that suggested she had calculated her physical resources carefully and was spending them with intention. She went to the general store, and she purchased what she could afford, and she asked Peabody's daughter where the nearest sources of water were in case the well continued to be unreliable. She went to the church on her first Sunday, and she was pleasant and appropriate, and she deflected questions about her past with a grace that was almost invisible. You had the feeling of the deflection without quite being able to point to it. Milton watched all of this from the careful middle distance that his property and hers created. His land ran along the eastern boundary of her claim. His cattle grazed within sight of her fence line on mornings when the light was good and the air was clear, and he had a habit of working the eastern pasture in the early hours when the day was still cool. And he told himself, this habit had nothing to do with the fact that her homestead was visible from that pasture, and everything to do with the quality of the grass along that particular stretch of his land, which was somewhat better than the grass elsewhere, which was true, and also not the complete truth. The first direct conversation he had with Annie Holloway was in March, 3 weeks after her arrival. She had come to his fence line on a Tuesday morning while he was replacing a section of wire, and she had stood on her side of it with her hands folded in front of her and waited for him to notice her instead of calling out, which he had appreciated without knowing why. When he straightened up and turned, she was looking at him steadily, and without any of the fluttering social performances that women in Harlow sometimes deployed when speaking to a man they did not know well. "Mr. Shelby," she said. She knew his name already, which meant she had asked someone, which meant she had been paying attention to her neighbors with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything else. "I wanted to ask you about your north fence line." "What about it?" he said. "2 of your fence posts are on my property," she said, "approximately 8 inches across the boundary line. I measured." He looked at her, he looked at the fence. "You measured," he said. "I did," she said, "with a surveyor's tape. I want to know if you are aware of the encroachment or whether it was done in error because the response is different depending on the answer." He had spent a long moment appreciating the precision of that. The response is different depending on the answer. She was not angry. She was not apologetic. She was factual, and she was prepared to be reasonable if the facts turned out to support reasonableness. He moved the fence posts. He moved them that same afternoon, which was faster than he strictly needed to, and he told himself this was because he believed in fair dealing, and not because he wanted her to think well of him. Both of those things were true, and he was honest enough to hold them simultaneously. After the fence posts, there were other conversations. They were brief and practical, and about the business of adjacent land, which was a subject with a great deal of material to cover in the early spring of a frontier year. Water rights and grazing boundaries and the shared road that ran between their properties and the drainage situation after heavy rain. He helped her complete the barn. He did not offer. She asked, plainly and without pretense, and he came with proper tools and an extra pair of hands he recruited from a ranch hand named Pete Calhoun who worked for him seasonally. And the three of them finished the barn in 2 days, and she fed them both a supper of salt pork and corn bread and black coffee that was better than anything Milton had eaten in recent memory. He did not tell her that. He was careful in those early months to stay on the right side of a line he had drawn for himself, the line that separated being a decent neighbor from being something more complicated than that. He was aware of the pull toward her, the way her laughter, which was rare and therefore significant, affected the quality of the air in a room. He was aware of the particular attention he gave to anything she said, the way he held it and turned it over after the conversation ended, examining it for depth. He was aware that he had started to think about her safety in a way that was disproportionate to any ordinary, neighborly concern. And he was aware, because he was a man who did not lie to himself, that his reasons for these things were not complicated. He was falling in love with Annie Holloway the way a dry plane falls into a thunderstorm, which is gradually and then completely, and with a great deal of electricity involved. What he did not know, and what would have changed his calculations significantly, was that Annie was engaged in a parallel awareness of him. She had been alone for 11 months when she arrived in Kansas. 11 months of the specific loneliness that comes after a marriage that was loving but brief. A husband who had been gentle and hardworking, and struck down at 28 by something as arbitrary as contaminated water. And her grief for Thomas Holloway had been real and deep, and had transformed over those 11 months into something more like a quiet, persistent ache than an acute wound. She had come to Kansas partly because the claim was hers by right and partly because she had needed somewhere to put her hands to work and her mind to focus, and the homestead had provided both. She had not come looking for anything else, but Milton Shelby had a quality that defeated her intentions. It was the quietness partly. She had grown up around men who filled space with noise as a substitute for substance, and the contrast of a man who said exactly what he meant and nothing more was startling and then compelling. It was the way he moved, economically and without theater. It was the way he listened with his whole attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually present in what she was saying. It was the scarred hands and the careful eyes, and the way he had moved those fence posts the same afternoon she had mentioned them, without argument or embarrassment, simply because it was the right thing to do. And it was something harder to name than any of those specific things, something underneath the surface of him that she recognized the way you recognize a word in a language you only partly speak. There was damage there, old and healed over but still present, and she knew what it felt like to carry that kind of history because she carried her own version of it, and the recognition created a sympathy that was different from ordinary sympathy and more dangerous. She had been very careful not to let any of this show. Then Harlan Voss had sent a man to her door. The first approach had been in June, friendly and plausible. A representative of the Voss Land and Cattle Company had come to inform her that Mr. Voss was interested in purchasing her claim and would pay a fair price, and was she interested in discussing terms. She had said she was not interested in selling, and had been polite about it because the man had been polite, and there was no call to be otherwise. He had nodded and said he understood and left. In July, a second man came with a better price and the information, delivered as helpfully as possible, that 2 of her neighbors to the west had already sold their claims to Mr. Voss, and that the railroad, when it came through, would make staying in this area very difficult for small operations because of the changes in land use patterns, and she might want to think carefully about her options. She had thanked him for his perspective, and said she was still not interested and closed the door. In August, a section of her fence along the south boundary had come down in the night. She had found it in the morning and repaired it and said nothing to anyone because she could not prove it had been done deliberately, and she did not want to be the woman who cried wolf. In September, her well had become contaminated in a way that was difficult to explain by natural causes. She had gone to the Peabody store for water until she could clean and reline the well, and she had done this work herself because she could not afford to pay someone to do it, and she had done it with a thoroughness that took 4 days and left her hands raw. By October, she had understood that Harlan Voss was not going to accept her refusal gracefully, and that the pressure was going to escalate, and that she was, in the most practical sense, alone in facing it because she had no family within 1,000 miles and no money to hire legal representation and a sheriff who was 61 years old and deeply reluctant to take positions that might make Harlan Voss uncomfortable. She had not told Milton any of this. She had not told him because she was afraid of what it would mean to tell him. Asking for help was the kind of thing that changed relationships, and she was not sure what their relationship was or what she wanted it to become, and she was not ready to have that clarified by necessity. The territory between them was uncertain and charged, and she had been living in it with the careful, focused attention of someone crossing a river on stepping stones, not looking up, not looking down, just placing each foot with precision and hoping the next stone held. But Milton had found out anyway. He had been at the feed store in the second week of October when he had heard 2 of Voss's riders talking in the way that men who believe themselves unobserved will talk, casually and specifically, about the plan to settle the matter of the Holloway homestead before the end of the month. He had stood very still behind a shelf of dry goods and listened to everything they said, and what they said had been specific enough and alarming enough that, by the time he walked home, he had already made the decision. He would watch her property. He would do it quietly, without telling her, because telling her would require a conversation he did not yet know how to have, and because the watching was something he could do right now while the conversation was still taking shape inside him. He had sat with his supper untouched on the table of his small house for 4 consecutive evenings, watching the lantern light in Annie's windows until it went dark, watching the fence line and the road and the dark shapes of the tall grass moving in the wind for anything that was not wind. He had told himself this was simply the behavior of a responsible neighbor, a man who had heard a threat and was taking reasonable precautions. He had not quite convinced himself. And then on the 4th night work had come, and Milton had moved without thinking about it in the way that you do when the decision has already been made somewhere below the level of thought and is simply waiting to be expressed as action. After Rourke rode away into the dark and the tension of the confrontation had dissipated into the cool October air, Annie Holloway stood in her doorway and looked at Milton Shelby and said, quietly and without any particular drama, "You should come inside." He came inside. Her home was small and orderly with the specific orderliness of someone who has learned to make limited space function beyond its dimensions. There was a cast iron stove that she used for both cooking and heat, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised him slightly because there were more of them than he expected, and they showed real use. There was a braided rug on the floor that she had made herself from scraps of old clothing, and there were curtains on the 2 windows that were made of flour sacking and were clean and pressed. There was a photograph on the shelf beside the books, a man in his Sunday clothes looking seriously at the camera, and Milton looked at it for a moment and understood without being told. She put water on to boil and they sat at the table, and she told him everything. She told him about the June approach and the July approach and the fence that came down in August and the well in September. And as she talked, he watched her face and saw the effort it was costing her to say these things plainly without the emotion that was underneath them becoming visible. And he admired the effort while also wanting, with a sudden and specific intensity, to relieve her of the necessity of it. "You should have told me," he said, when she had finished. "I know," she said. She looked at her hands on the table. "I did not want to ask." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, considering whether to give him the surface answer or the real one. "Because I have been asking things of this land and this life for 11 months, and it keeps being harder than I expected, and I did not want to find out that you were something else I had misjudged." The honesty of this landed in his chest like something settling into place. He thought about telling her that she had not misjudged him. He thought about telling her a great many things: the 4 nights of watching, the untouched suppers, the way he had been carrying the knowledge of the threat for weeks, and the simultaneous knowledge of what that sustained concern meant about his feelings. He thought about Clara, and about the lesson he had taken from Clara, which was that the gap between who you thought someone was and who they actually were could be fatal to everything you had built around the assumption. And then he thought about the difference between Clara and Annie, which was that everything he had observed about Annie Holloway over 8 months was consistent. There was no gap. The surface and the depth were the same material, just at different pressures. She was exactly who she appeared to be, and the appearing had cost her something every single day. "You have not misjudged me," he said. She looked up at him. "I have been watching your property for 4 nights," he said, "because I heard Voss's writers talking in Peabody's store about a plan to settle the matter of your land before the end of the month. I should have told you immediately, and I did not because I was trying to work out how to say other things at the same time, and I took too long, and tonight almost went differently than it did." The silence between them had changed quality entirely. It was no longer the silence of 2 people being carefully appropriate with each other. It was the silence of 2 people who have just removed a barrier and are standing in the space where it was. "Other things," Annie said. "Yes," he said. "What things?" He looked at her across the small table in the small room, with the stove ticking as it warmed and the wind pressing against the flour-sack curtains, and he said, "I think you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in 6 years in this county, Annie. And I think I have been in love with you since March and have been conducting myself as if I was not, which has been increasingly dishonest, and I find I am tired of it." The color that rose in her face was not embarrassment. It was something warmer and more specific. "Milton," she said. "You do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "You have enough to manage right now without." "I was going to say," she said with a firmness that stopped him, "that I find myself in a similar position and have found it equally inconvenient." He looked at her. She looked at him. The stove ticked. The wind moved outside. Then Annie Holloway laughed. It was the rare kind, the real kind, the kind that changed the quality of the air in the room, and Milton felt the tight place in his chest that had been there for 2 years dissolve like frost in morning sun. And before he had fully registered making the decision, he was laughing too. And they sat across that small table in the middle of the Kansas night and laughed at themselves and the situation and the months of careful, meticulous restraint that had ultimately been unnecessary. And it was one of the better sounds either of them had produced in a very long time. The practical reality of Harlan Voss reasserted itself by morning. Milton had stayed until the coffee was made and drunk, and the edges of the situation had been mapped with care. Rourke would report back to Voss. Voss would be displeased and would likely escalate. The escalation was not going to be stopped by one man watching a fence line, and the sheriff was unlikely to be useful, and the legal options available to Annie on her current budget were limited. What they had were facts, testimony, and the possibility of making those facts known in ways that would be costly to Voss if they were made public. "There is a land commissioner," Milton said, "out of Wichita. He is due to make his quarterly circuit through the county in 3 weeks. 3 weeks is a long time if Voss intends to move quickly," Annie said. "Yes," Milton said, "which means we need to make Voss believe that moving quickly would be a mistake." How? Milton thought about this carefully. He thought about the 3 operations that had been pressured out over the past 18 months, the Mueller farm and the Denton Place and old Carrie Preston's grazing land. He thought about the fact that none of those people had talked publicly because the pressure had been designed to isolate and silence. He thought about the fact that isolation was the weapon and connection was the remedy. "We need to talk to the Mueller family," he said, "and the Dentons." And Preston, if he is still in the county, we need the whole shape of what Voss has been doing written down and signed and sent to the land commissioner ahead of his visit. Annie was quiet for a moment. They may not want to revisit it. No, he said. They may not, but I think they will if we ask them properly. The next 3 weeks were the most purposeful Milton Shelby had felt in years. He and Annie worked the problem together with a division of labor that seemed to emerge naturally from their different capacities. He rode to the outlying properties and talked to the displaced families with the patient, factual, unhurried manner that turned out to be exactly what those conversations required. The Muellers had gone to their daughter's place in the next county and were still raw with the injustice of what had been done to them. The Dentons had moved into Harlow itself and taken jobs at the livery and the general store, and the humiliation of that displacement sat heavily on a man who had worked his own land for 12 years. Preston was still in the county, staying with a nephew, an old man with a sharp memory and a great deal of carefully banked anger. All of them talked to Milton. All of them agreed to have their testimony recorded. Annie, meanwhile, made the records. She had a hand for writing that was clean and precise, and she organized the testimonies with a logical clarity that built a comprehensive picture of a pattern, dates and incidents, and the specific words used in each approach, the implied and sometimes explicit threats, the sequence of damaging events that followed refusal. She also pulled out the relevant sections of the Homestead Act and the Kansas land statutes, and cross-referenced the pressure tactics against specific legal violations, which took her 2 days, and the systematic use of every resource available in the Peabody store's small lending collection, and what she had in her own books. On the 7th night after Rourke's visit, she spread the papers on the table and went through them with Milton, and the picture they made together was damning. Voss had been committing what amounted to systematic fraud and intimidation across multiple properties over 18 months. The railroad connection was the motive, and the acquisition timeline corresponded precisely with the railroad survey schedule, information that was supposedly private but clearly had been shared with Voss through channels that implied corruption at the survey level. "This is enough," Annie said. "If it reaches the right hands." "It will reach them," Milton said. He was reading through her summary, and the quality of his attention was the total kind that she had learned to recognize as his highest form of engagement. "This is very good work, Annie." She looked at him across the papers and the lamp and said, "We did this together." He looked up. There was something in his face that was very still and very warm at once, and he said, "Yes, we did." The tension between them had been building for days in the way that tension builds between two people who have acknowledged what they feel for each other and have been too busy managing a crisis to act on it, which creates a kind of sustained electricity that is both inconvenient and magnificent. She was aware of him in every room they shared. She was aware of the exact distance between them at every moment and of the moments when that distance decreased, when he leaned over the table to read something she was pointing to, or when she stood beside him at her fence line in the cold morning light. She was aware that she was aware of these things, and that being aware of her awareness was its own particular condition. On the 8th day, Voss sent a more serious representative. This was not Rourke, who was a bully with a rifle and a moderate intelligence. This was a man named Garrett Sillies, who had ridden in from Wichita and who wore a good suit and carried himself with the authority of someone who solved problems for powerful men in ways that left very little legal evidence. He came to Annie's door in the middle of the afternoon, and he was courteous and pleasant, and he brought a document that was described as a final offer, a purchase price that was notably higher than previous offers. Annie read it carefully. Then she set it on the table. "Mr. Sillies," she said, "I am going to ask you a straightforward question, and I would like a straightforward answer. Is this offer contingent on my agreeing not to speak publicly about the manner in which previous offers were communicated to me?" Sillies looked at her with careful appreciation, the way a man looks at a chess opponent who has made an unexpected and inconvenient move. "That is a very specific question." "It is," she said. "The specificity is intentional. The offer stands on its own merits, he said, which was not an answer. Then the answer is no, she said. And I think you should be aware, Mr. Sillies, that the full account of Mr. Voss's approach to this and several other properties in Caldwell County has been put into writing and will be delivered to the land commissioner when he arrives in 3 weeks. I say this not as a threat but as information that seems relevant to any conversation about further approaches. Sillies was very still for a moment. Then he said, "That would be an interesting move on your part." "I thought so," she said. After he left, she sat at the table for a few minutes with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Then she walked to the door and looked east at the boundary between her property and Milton's, and he was there. She had known he would be, working his fence line in the long afternoon light with the easy, unhurried motion of a man who had been doing exactly that all morning and had not been watching the road at all. She walked to him. He looked up when she was close enough and read her face with the accuracy she had come to rely on. "He left," Milton said. "He left," she confirmed. "Did he threaten you?" "No. He was too smooth for that, but I told him about the records and the commissioner." A brief pause. "How did he take that?" "Carefully," she said. Milton was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Voss will decide in the next day or two whether to push harder or cut his losses on this particular property and focus his pressure elsewhere. The records being documented changes his calculus." "I thought so," she said. And then, because the situation had been resolved to whatever degree it could be resolved right now, and the afternoon was very clear, and the light was very good, and she had been patient for 8 days, and she was tired of being patient, she said, "Milton, I would like you to stop working your fence line and come inside and have supper with me." He looked at her. He set down the fencing tool he was holding with a deliberateness that was almost funny. "Yes," he said. "I would like that very much." The supper was the first of many, which was a fact both of them understood by the end of it, though neither of them said so explicitly. They talked for 3 hours over food and coffee and the comfortable candlelight of her small house, and they talked about things that were not the crisis with Voss, which was the first time they had had space for other conversations. She told him about growing up in Missouri with a mother who had taught school and a father who had worked the railroad, and the peculiar combination of educational aspiration and practical frontier pragmatism that had produced her. He told her about Colorado, about the cattle work he had done before and the small herd he had built here, about the things he had learned from failing at other things. He did not tell her about Clara, not yet, but the outline of the gap in his history was perceptible and she did not press it. What she did, near the end of the evening when the candle had burned low, was reach across the table and cover his scarred hand with hers. It was not a dramatic gesture. It did not need to be. His hand turned under hers and his fingers closed around her fingers, and they sat like that for a long, quiet moment, and it was the most intimate thing either of them had experienced in years, not because of its physical character, but because of its voluntary simplicity. Neither of them was performing or calculating or protecting. They were just two people who had found each other on the edge of a difficult territory and decided to stop pretending they had not. He walked home in the dark under a sky full of stars, and he felt the specific elation of a man who has set down something heavy he has been carrying for a long time and discovered that his arms work fine without it. The land commissioner arrived in Caldwell County on a Tuesday in the first week of November, 3 days before he was expected, which turned out to matter. His name was James Alcott, and he was 53 and methodical, and he had seen a great deal of frontier corruption in his 12 years of riding the commissioner's circuit, and he had learned to identify it by a particular quality of too smooth presentation and too clean paperwork. He received Annie's written documentation the morning of his arrival, delivered by Milton, who had ridden to meet him on the county road, and he read it over a long breakfast at the Harlow Hotel, and when he was finished, he sat back and looked at Milton with the expression of a man who has just confirmed a hypothesis he had been testing. "Voss," he said. "Voss," Milton said. "I have been hearing things about Voss from several quarters," Alcott said. "Nothing with this quality of documentation, though." This is very thorough work. It is, Milton said. The woman who compiled it is someone you should speak to. Alcott spent the next 2 days conducting interviews. He talked to the Mueller family and the Dentons and Preston, and he talked to Milton and to Annie at considerable length, and he talked to several other property owners in the county who had their own observations to contribute once it became known that an official inquiry was underway. He talked to Sheriff Decker, who was guarded but not actively obstructive once it became clear that the commissioner's authority superseded whatever arrangement Decker might have preferred to maintain. He did not talk to Harlan Voss until the 3rd day. That conversation was private, and Milton had no way of knowing exactly what was said in it. What he knew was that Voss left Harlow by private coach on the 4th day, and that Garrett Sillies had not been seen since the morning of the commissioner's arrival, and that the representative of the Voss Land and Cattle Company, who had been stationed at the county land office to manage the paperwork on the acquisitions, had begun a very thorough and hasty reorganization of certain documents before Alcott's people arrived to review them. On the 5th day, Commissioner Alcott filed a formal report and initiated a legal review of all Voss's land acquisitions in the county over the preceding 18 months. He could not restore the Mueller farm or the Denton claim because those sales had been signed. However, they had been coerced, and the legal mechanism for reversal was slow and uncertain. But he froze all pending Voss acquisitions, and he referred the matter to the federal land office in Wichita, and he put Harlan Voss's name on a list that would be reviewed by people with considerably more authority than the Caldwell County Sheriff. He came to Annie's homestead on his last morning in the county and shook her hand formally. "Your documentation was decisive, Mrs. Holloway," he said. The organization and the cross-referencing of the statutes was the work of someone with a genuine legal understanding. "I read carefully," she said. "You did more than that," he said. He looked at her with the evaluating attention of someone who assesses competence professionally. "I am going to suggest to the federal office that they consider whether a county like this one might benefit from a properly appointed land advocate, someone local who knows the territory and the people. Not an attorney necessarily, but someone who can help small claim holders understand their rights and document their situations before they deteriorate to the point they did here." He paused. "I think you might be someone worth considering for a role of that kind." Annie was very still for a moment. Then she said, "I would like to hear more about what that would involve." Alcott told her. It would be a modest appointed position with a modest stipend, which would not make her wealthy but would make the homestead financially viable in a way that the farming alone might not sustain indefinitely. She would keep her property. She would have official standing when dealing with land disputes, and she would have direct access to the federal land office. It would not be a large life, but it would be a substantial one. She said she would consider it and write to him. After he left, she stood in the doorway of her home in the clear November cold and looked at the sky and felt something uncurl inside her that had been contracted tight for a very long time. The fear was gone. Not the permanent, alert kind of attention that life on the frontier required, but the specific dread that had been living underneath her daily work since June, the knowledge that forces larger than herself were working systematically against everything she was building. That was gone. The land was still hers, the work was still hers, and the future for the first time had the shape of something she could choose. She walked to Milton's property. He was at his house, doing evening chores in the way he did, with the quiet efficiency that she found deeply comforting in a way that used to surprise her and did not anymore. He saw her coming and he straightened up and read her face, and he was smiling before she had covered the last 50 yards, a slow, careful smile that was his real one, the one she had learned to distinguish from the polite social version in the first weeks of knowing him. "It is over," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard Alcott's wagon leave this morning. He offered me a position," she said. He looked at her. "What kind?" she told him. He listened with the complete attention he always brought to things she said, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment in the way that meant he was thinking seriously rather than hesitating. "Annie," he said, "how do you feel about it?" "I feel like I want to take it," she said. "I feel like it would be very good work." She paused. "I also feel like I want to know what you think." "I think it is exactly right for you," he said, "and I think you will be remarkable at it." She looked at him. The sky behind him was going orange and purple over the flat line of the prairie, the kind of sunset that happened several times each year in Kansas that looked almost too dramatic to be real, and he was standing in the foreground of it with his honest face and his careful eyes and the absolute steadiness that had been the first thing she noticed about him, and was still the thing she relied on most. "Milton," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "When you moved those fence posts in March," she said, "the same afternoon I mentioned them, was that because you are just a fair-dealing man, or was it because you already cared what I thought of you?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Both," he said, "in roughly equal measure." She laughed, the real kind. And then she stepped forward and she put her arms around him in the clear, cold November evening, and he held her with both arms, completely and without reservation, and they stood like that in the darkening light with the prairie wind moving around them and the horses moving quietly in the corral and the shape of their two properties extending in both directions, and it was the most natural thing either of them had ever done. He said against her hair, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. He told her about Clara. He told it simply and without self-pity, the marriage and the collapse of it, and the 2 years of rebuilding, and the particular wariness he had been carrying since, the fear of the gap between appearance and reality, the way he had spent 8 months watching her and finding no gap, and what that had done to the wariness. He told her he had been afraid that what he felt for her was built on a projection, on what he hoped she was rather than who she actually was, and that the 8 months had answered that question in the only way that mattered, which was time and observation, and the evidence of how a person behaves when the territory proves hard. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Your fear makes complete sense." "Yes," he said, and, he said, "I am not afraid anymore." She pulled back far enough to look at his face. He was looking at her with the full, unguarded expression of a man who has come to the end of a very long, careful reservation and found something better on the other side of it. "Good," she said. He kissed her in the last of the sunset light, gently and then with the specific warmth of a thing that has been contained for months becoming itself, and the Kansas sky went its impossible colors above them, and the prairie moved in the wind, and it was, by any measure, a very fine evening. They did not rush what came next. This was partly temperament, hers and his, and partly the practical realities of frontier life, which did not leave a great deal of room for the prolonged romantic ceremonies that the novels in Annie's small collection tended to favor. What it left room for was honest conversation and shared work, and the gradual deepening of something that had already been deep. Through November and into December, he came to her house for supper 3 evenings a week, and she came to his on 2 others, and they spent these evenings doing things that were not entirely different from what they had been doing before the declaration, reading and talking and working through the practical problems of land and animals and winter preparation. Except that the quality of the time was entirely different because neither of them was managing the distance between them any more, and the relief of that was enormous. He told her more about Colorado, slowly in pieces, not because the telling was painful but because he wanted her to know all of it, and there was a great deal of it, and these evenings were the right container for it. She told him more about Missouri and about Thomas, her husband, and about the marriage that had been genuinely good and genuinely short, and about the specific guilt that she had carried for months about allowing herself to feel things for another person, the irrational but persistent sense that moving forward was a betrayal of something. "Is it still there?" he asked about the guilt. "The feeling," she thought about it honestly. "Less than it was," she said. "Thomas would have liked you. That helps actually, he was a practical man. Was he a quiet man? Milton asked. She looked at him with something that was almost mischief. He was not, she said. He talked constantly. It was one of the things I loved about him. He filled rooms with stories. She paused. You are a different kind of love from him, not better or worse. Different. The word love, said plainly like that, hung in the air for a moment. Different is good, Milton said. Different is exactly right, she said. He proposed in December, on a Sunday after church, standing outside the Harlow church in the cold morning, with the rest of the congregation filtering past them, and the bell still resonating in the clear air. He had planned to do it somewhere more private, and had found, in the moment, that the straightforward location was exactly correct, because the declaration was one he would make anywhere, and the privacy of it was internal rather than spatial. He said what he felt with the precision he brought to everything, and she said yes with the immediacy of someone who had already made the decision and was simply waiting to be asked. The congregation filtered back toward them with congratulations in varying degrees of warmth. The Peabody family was genuinely delighted. Sheriff Decker shook Milton's hand with the gruff approval of an older man who has watched a younger one navigate a difficult year with integrity. Several women pressed Annie's hands and said things that were kind. One older woman said, with the particular candor of the frontier elderly, that it was about time, which made Annie laugh the good laugh, and Milton stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back, and felt the specific completeness of a man who has found the right place to be. They were married in February of 1883, exactly 1 year after Annie had arrived in Harlow with her 2 trunks and her milk cow, and her absolute refusal to be discouraged. The ceremony was held in the Harlow church with the Peabodys and the Deckers and old Preston and the Mueller family, who had come back for the occasion from the next county, and Pete Calhoun, Milton's ranch hand, who stood up with him and wore a suit that was slightly too large and looked profoundly pleased about everything. Annie wore a dress that she had made herself from fabric ordered from Wichita, a dark blue wool that was practical and also beautiful, and she carried a small arrangement of late-dried flowers that she had preserved from the summer. She said her vows with the clarity and directness she brought to everything that mattered, and Milton said his with the measured weight of a man who does not say things he does not mean, and therefore means completely what he says. And when the Reverend pronounced them married, the church responded with the warmth of a community that has watched 2 good people find each other through difficulty, and is glad about the outcome. The reception afterward was held at the Peabody house, because it was the largest available space, and there was music from a fiddle player named Horace who was 70 years old, and whose arthritis had no measurable effect on his playing, and there was food that the congregation had contributed in the potluck tradition of frontier gatherings, and there was a great deal of genuine goodwill in the room that made it feel larger than its dimensions. Milton danced with Annie, which surprised her because she had not known he could dance, and he had not mentioned it. He was not spectacular at it, but he was competent, and he moved with the same economical precision he brought to everything physical, and she looked up at him while they moved and thought that she was very glad she had come to Kansas and that she was very glad she had measured those fence posts. "You are dancing," she said. "I am," he said. "Where did you learn?" "Colorado," he said. "I had a winter with very little to do and a neighbor who believed dancing was a fundamental survival skill." She was right, Annie said. She was 64 and had buried 2 husbands, Milton said. She was right about most things. Annie laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, and the fiddle played, and the lamplight was warm, and outside the Kansas winter was cold and honest and full of stars. They combined the households. This was a practical decision with a great deal of logistical content, and they made it with the same organized thoroughness they brought to every practical problem, which meant sitting down with paper and thinking clearly about what the combined property could support and what the priorities were. Annie kept her homestead and her position as county land advocate, which had been formally confirmed by the federal office in December. Milton kept his cattle operation and his lease on the eastern pasture. They determined that her house was better positioned on the combined property and that his was more structurally sound, and they proceeded to move the contents of his house into hers, and then engage Pete Calhoun and 2 other men in a week's work expanding and reinforcing the structure to make it adequate for 2 people. And they both understood, without quite saying it yet, the possibility of more. The Harlan Voss situation resolved in the spring. The Federal Review found sufficient grounds to void 2 of the acquisitions that had been made under clear duress, which meant the Denton claim was returned to the Denton family, who cried when they received the letter and who came back to work their land in April with a thoroughness that had the quality of reclamation. The Mueller situation was more complicated because the family had already invested their payment in their daughter's property, but a settlement was reached that included a formal apology and a financial adjustment that the federal office characterized as restitution for damages, which was a term with legal precision that Voss's attorney had argued against and lost. Voss himself did not return to Caldwell County. His cattle empire contracted significantly over the following 2 years under the pressure of the legal review and the loss of the railroad access that had been the whole premise of his acquisition strategy. By 1884, the Voss Land and Cattle Company had been dissolved, and the man himself had retreated to Chicago, where his particular skills in frontier pressure tactics were less applicable, and his history less convenient to his aspirations. Milton heard about this from Pete Calhoun, who had heard it from a rider passing through, and he told Annie over supper. "Good," she said simply. "That is all," he said. "What else is there?" she said. "Is gone, and the people he hurt have some measure of what they lost returned to them. The rest is just a story about a man making bad choices." She looked at Milton with the clear, direct gaze that he had been the subject of for over a year now and never entirely got used to. "I'm not very interested in stories about men making bad choices when there is so much to do here." He thought this was one of the most sensible things he had ever heard. The spring of 1883 was very good for them. The cattle operation expanded with the purchase of 12 additional head at the market in Wichita, which Milton had been planning for 2 years, and which the combined household finances now made possible. The Homestead fields went in with a larger planting than Annie had managed alone, because 2 people working a field is genuinely different from one, not just in quantity of labor, but in the possibility of more ambitious planting strategy when you are not having to calculate physical reserves so narrowly. They put in corn and winter wheat, and a kitchen garden that was larger than strictly necessary because Annie had opinions about kitchen gardens that ran toward the generous. She also planted a rose bush along the south side of the house, brought from a cutting that had been given to her by Mrs. Peabody on the occasion of her marriage. It was not a practical object, a rose. It was entirely decorative, and it required attention and water during dry spells, and it was going to take at least a year before it bloomed. Milton looked at it on the afternoon she planted it, crouching in the April soil with her hands working around the roots with practiced care, and he felt something in the region of his chest that was too large for the occasion of a rosebush and was therefore about something else entirely. "It will take a year," he said. "I know," she said, not looking up. "Some things are worth waiting for." He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides, and a feeling that he did not have a name for precisely, but that made the world look very clear and very good. "Yes," he said, "they are." In the summer, Annie took on her first formal case as county land advocate, which involved a widow named Elsie Hartman whose 80-acre claim was being contested by a neighbor who had filed an amended survey that moved the boundary line in his favor by enough to include her water source. Annie spent a week reviewing the original survey documents and the amended filing and the relevant statutes, and she appeared before the County Land Board in Harlow with a brief that was so precisely organized and specifically argued that the board took less than 2 hours to rule in Elsie Hartman's favor. Elsie cried. She was 56 and had been on her land for 9 years, and the idea of losing her water source had been keeping her up at night for 4 months. Annie held her hand while she cried and thought about the commissioner's description of the work as giving small claim holders an understanding of their rights, and she thought that what the work was actually about was giving people who had built something real the ability to keep it, and she was very glad to be doing it. She told Milton about the ruling over supper. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant the thing was sitting in him and having weight. Then he said, "I am very proud of you." She looked at him. He said this kind of thing rarely and meant it entirely when he did, and the experience of being told it by him was therefore worth more than the same words said by most people. "Thank you," she said. "Elsie Hartman is going to tell everyone she knows," he said. "I expect so," Annie said. "You are going to have a great deal of work," he said. "I expect so," she said again and smiled. The rosebush bloomed the following spring, in April of 1884. With a modesty that was entirely appropriate to a first year, and a color that was deep red against the weathered wood of the house's south wall. Annie stood and looked at it on the morning it opened, and Milton came up behind her, and they stood together in the early light looking at this small, impractical, beautiful thing that had taken a year to become itself. "Worth it," he said. "Told you," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And the morning was cold and clear, and their breath made small clouds in the air, and the cattle moved in the eastern pasture and somewhere over the boundary line between what had been her property and his, and was now theirs. A meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do in April on the Kansas plains, which is to make an argument for the world being fundamentally good. Their son was born in the summer of 1884. They named him James, for the land commissioner who had come through the county at precisely the right moment, and because it was a good plain name that suited the kind of people they were. He was born at the end of July with the help of the Harlow midwife, a competent Mennonite woman named Maria Schrock, who had delivered half the county and who told Annie afterward that she was a very sensible patient, which Annie took as a high compliment. Milton held his son on the first evening of his life and was so thoroughly undone by the experience that he had to go outside for a few minutes and stand in the summer dark and simply breathe. And when he came back and Annie was watching the door with an expression that was tired and illuminated and more tender than anything he had ever seen on a human face, and she said, "Are you all right?" "No," he said. "In the best possible way." "Good," she said. James Shelby grew into a solid, serious child with his father's eyes and his mother's capacity for focused attention, and the homestead expanded around him as he grew. The barn was built out to proper dimensions in the winter of 1884, which meant that Pete Calhoun, who had become something between an employee and a fixture in the life of the Shelby operation, had a proper place to work rather than the three-quarter structure that had been serving since the beginning. Pete was genuinely delighted about this. Annie's work as land advocate grew steadily through 1884 and into 1885. She handled 11 formal cases in the first 2 years and won 9 of them, and the 2 she did not win were cases where the legal situation was genuinely ambiguous rather than cases of clear injustice, and she was honest with her clients about the distinction. Her reputation in the county was specific and useful, and people came to her from as far as 20 miles away when they had land questions, and she managed all of this while also managing the homestead and a small child, which required a level of organization that would have impressed a general. Milton watched her do all of this with the sustained admiration of a man who knows the weight of what he is watching and finds it does not diminish. He was not idle in this period. The cattle operation grew steadily and responsibly, from the original small herd to a genuine going concern that put him in the middle tier of Caldwell County cattle operations by 1885, which was not the largest tier, but was very solid and was built on no debt and no compromises. He hired Pete Calhoun permanently, which Pete responded to by becoming even more efficient than he had been as a seasonal worker, and he brought on a second man in the busy seasons. He also fixed every fence line on the combined property to a standard that was, according to Pete Calhoun, unnecessary, excessive, and perfect, which was an accurate characterization. On the second anniversary of their marriage, in February of 1885, Milton built Annie a proper writing desk for her land advocate work. He built it himself, from walnut wood that he had ordered from a lumber supplier in Wichita, and shaped over the preceding 6 weeks in the barn while she was at the house with James, and it had a surface that was exactly the right height for her, which he had measured carefully, and 3 drawers with proper brass fittings, and a small carved detail along the front edge that was the only decorative element, and was a repeating pattern of the kind of grass that grew along the eastern pasture boundary. She looked at it for a long time when he brought it in and set it against the wall where her old table had been. "The grass," she said, touching the carving. "The eastern pasture," he said, "where I spent a great many mornings pretending not to watch your property." She turned around and looked at him, and the look had everything in it. The 8 months of careful distance and the October night, and the papers spread on the table and the winter, and the proposal, and the marriage and James asleep in his cradle, and the rosebush on the south wall, and all the suppers and all the evenings and all the work and all the particular, specific, daily love that is the truest love there is, the kind built from accumulated mornings rather than from drama. She did not say anything. She stepped forward and took his face in her hands, and kissed him with a completeness that rendered words unnecessary. Later, they sat together in the good evening light, James on a blanket on the floor engaged in the serious business of attempting to reach a wooden toy that was slightly too far from him, and Annie was at her new desk arranging her current case files, with the systematic pleasure of a person given exactly the right tool for their work, and Milton was reading the weekly newspaper from Wichita. And the stove was going, and the house was warm, and outside the February wind was doing what it always did on the Kansas plains, which was remind you that the territory was vast and indifferent, and that everything you had built against it was the result of your own effort and your own choosing. "Milton," Annie said. "Yes," he said, "James is going to need a sibling." He looked up from the newspaper. She was looking at him over her shoulder with a smile that was very specific about its meaning. He set down the newspaper. "Is that so?" he said. "I believe so," she said. "He is very serious and very focused, and I think he would benefit enormously from the company of someone who is not." "You are hoping for a different temperament," he said. "I am hoping for chaos and noise," she said. "To balance things out, we are all very organized here." He laughed, which was the kind of laugh that came from deep in the chest and lit his whole face, the laugh she had worked to earn for 2 years and that still felt like a specific achievement every time. "I will take that under advisement," he said. "Please do," she said. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1886, in April, which meant she arrived in the same month that the rosebush bloomed for the 3rd time. They named her Clara, which was Milton's idea, and which he offered one evening with a directness that showed he had thought about it carefully. He said he would like to name something good after a period that had not been, because that seemed to him the right way to handle the past, not to bury it, but to give its name to something worth keeping. Annie had looked at him for a moment and then said yes, that was exactly right, and meant it from a place that had nothing to do with the woman from Colorado and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. Clara Shelby came into the world with a force and volume that made the midwife laugh, which Maria Schrock did not often do, and she looked around the room with the wide, evaluating attention of someone who has arrived somewhere new and is immediately forming opinions. She was chaos and noise from the first week, and she was magnificent. James, at not quite 2 years old, regarded her with the grave attention he brought to everything new, and then, over the following weeks, became her most devoted servant, which was a dynamic that persisted through their childhoods and amused their parents enormously. By 1887, the Shelby property was the most successful small combined operation in the county, and not because of size or ambition in the large sense, But because of the dual income of the cattle operation and the land advocate stipend, and because of the absence of debt, and because of the two people running it who were, in their different ways, exceptionally competent and exceptionally compatible, Milton managed the land and the animals with the quiet precision that was his natural mode. Annie managed the legal and organizational work, and the household with the focused efficiency that was hers. They overlapped in everything that mattered and complemented each other in everything else, and they did it in the daily, unheroic, accumulating way that turns out to be the most durable form of love the territory can produce. The Muellers came back to their original claim in the summer of 1887, after the Federal Review's final determination awarded them a restored title and a compensation payment from the Voss estate, which had been a legal process of considerable complexity that Annie had helped them navigate from the beginning. The day the Muellers moved back onto their land was a Tuesday in June, and the whole county seemed to know about it, and several families drove out to welcome them, including Milton and Annie with James and Clara, and a covered dish of salt pork and roasted corn. Heinrich Mueller, who was 60 years old and had the hands and bearing of a man who had been working his own land for 4 decades, stood in the yard of his restored homestead and looked at Annie with an expression that needed no translation. "You did not give up," he said. "Neither did you," she said. He shook his head slowly. "We might have," he said, "without someone keeping the record. Keeping the record is the whole thing." She thought about that for a long time afterward. Keeping the record. She thought about the papers spread on the small table in the October night, the testimonies and the statute cross-references, and the systematic building of a shape that made the injustice visible. She thought about what the commissioner had said about small claim holders needing to understand their rights. She thought about the 11 cases and the 9 wins and the 2 honest losses. She thought about the way that the work had started as self-protection and had become something much larger, a kind of ongoing testimony to the fact that the territory belonged to the people who were building their lives in it, and not to the men with capital and connections who had decided to take it. She wrote a letter to the land commissioner in Wichita that evening, outlining a proposal for a more formal framework for county land advocacy across the territory, with trained advocates in each major county and a central office to coordinate, share information, and provide legal resources that individual advocates could not access alone. It was a large proposal for a county land advocate with a modest stipend, and she was aware of this, and she sent it anyway. Alcott wrote back 3 weeks later. He said the proposal was excellent and probably 5 years ahead of its time, and he was going to forward it to the federal office with his recommendation. She showed the letter to Milton. He read it and looked up. 5 years ahead of its time, he said. He means it as a compliment, she said. I know, he said. You are going to be doing a great deal of writing over the next 5 years. I expect so, she said. He folded the letter and handed it back to her and looked at her with the full, quiet regard that she had come to understand was the highest form of his approval, the steady, unperformative kind that asked nothing and offered everything. Annie, he said. Yes, she said. I am continuously glad you measured those fence posts, he said. She looked at him. The late evening light was coming through the west window, and it was warm and gold, and it caught the silver that had started to show in his hair at the temples, which she found she liked very much. James was outside with Pete Calhoun doing whatever serious business they conducted together in the late afternoons. Clara was on the floor rearranging wooden blocks with the decisive, revisionary energy that characterized everything she did. I measured them, Annie said, because I needed to know the exact truth of the situation. I know, he said. That is still what I am doing, she said. In everything. I know, he said again, with the smile that was his real one. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the bench, and they stayed like that for a while in the good light. And Clara rearranged her blocks with great conviction. And outside, Pete Calhoun's voice carried through the window, explaining something to James about horses in the patient, detailed way he had, and the rosebush on the south wall would bloom again in April, and the cattle were in the eastern pasture. And the 40 acres that had once been at the center of a fight about who the territory belonged to were peaceful and well-tended and growing. And the woman who had come from Missouri with 2 trunks and a milk cow and a set jaw, and the man who had come from Colorado with a small herd, and a particular kind of damage that had healed into a particular kind of strength, had built something that was larger than either of them had imagined on the October night when a standoff at a lantern-lit door had made the hidden thing between them visible. They had built a life, deliberately and with eyes open, out of honest work and honest love and the sustained, daily choosing of each other that is the deepest form of declaration any 2 people can make. The Kansas sky was very large above all of it. The prairie was very old and very patient. And in the house on the combined Shelby property on the eastern edge of Caldwell County, in the warm light of an ordinary evening in 1887, everything that had needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that had needed to grow had grown, and the story had arrived exactly where stories about courage and honesty and love deserve to arrive, which is not at an ending in any diminished sense, but at the beginning of a long, good, continuing thing that the ending only marks the threshold of. Milton Shelby looked at his wife and his daughter and listened to the sound of his son's voice outside and felt the specific, enormous, ordinary happiness that comes to people who have survived the dark past and found their way to something true. He was a quiet man. He did not say most of what he felt, but he had said enough, and what he had done had always said the rest. He had left his supper untouched on the table. He had watched over her in the dark. He had stepped between her and the danger without a weapon and without a plan beyond the decision to stand there. And that had been the first word of a very long and very good conversation that was still, and would be for many years, happily continuing.